So this is the belated voter breakdown of the Iowa caucuses that I promised in my February update video. I'll be using the New York Times article, Iowa Caucuses, Who Different Groups Supported, for this video, in which they took a survey of caucusers across the state of Iowa as they entered their caucus. For the sake of consistency, when I do my New Hampshire video, I also want to use the New York Times' numbers, but as of right now, I can't seem to find a similar article, so we'll see. Additionally, I'm only covering the demographic half of this article. The issues and attitudes section will be saved for a different format, sometime after the New Hampshire voter breakdown video. To start out with, Sanders won the majority of the votes in the Iowa caucuses. As of the release of this video, the Sanders campaign is triggering a recanvassing, after which a recount can be done that might change the state delegate equivalents and ultimately the total actual delegates awarded. Now, there's a whole lot of shenanigans regarding that which people have obsessed over since Iowa failed to announce the numbers on the night of the caucuses, as they were supposed to. I'm not going to rehash that here. I'm focusing on the coalitions that each major candidate built or failed to build, based on their popular vote. Because at the end of the day, that's all that really matters in these first few tiny states, only handing out a relative handful of delegates. First, let's look at gender and age. Both Sanders and Buttigieg had managed in Iowa to build campaigns that on their face appeared to be balanced between men and women. In reality, this is not quite the case, as the Democratic primary voters tend to have around a 45 to 55 split between men and women. In this case, it turned out that Warren and Klobuchar, the two women candidates in the top 5, did the best with women. Now, if the Iowa caucus night coverage on television and how the New Hampshire primary played out said anything, it suggests that there's a significant swing between Warren and Klobuchar. Why that is, I'm going to mention a bit in this video, but I'll probably focus a lot more on with the New Hampshire primary video. Anyway, unsurprisingly, Bernie Sanders dominated with those under 45, and perhaps a bit surprisingly, he did the worst among the top 5 with those above 45 years old. This is the beginnings of showing how important age is as a factor in Sanders' support as we dig deeper into this survey. However, before I go on to what happens when age and gender are combined, we should note that Sanders' support among age groups slopes downward the older the voter is, at a relatively consistent rate. Buttigieg's support rises and then flattens out at around 30 years old, and Warren's peaks in the middle, while Joe Biden's support is single digits among anyone below 50, with 20 percentage points for those above that age group, and Klobuchar following a similar pattern to Biden in these Iowa numbers. Now, when one combines age and gender, you see a similar pattern for Sanders. However, notably, for those above 45, Sanders is stronger among women than he is with men. Pete's numbers, when you look at the age-gender breakdown, is pretty interesting in some respects. His support among women between 18 and 29 is far higher than his support among men in that same age range. This gap is even bigger with him than it is with Warren. I have a theory as to why that's the case, and it is purely speculative. But if you spend a lot of time reading online literature, you can probably guess what I'm thinking. But I'll leave it like that because, as I said, it's just speculative. It is at ages 30 to 44 that you see men supporting Buttigieg at a significantly higher rate than women do. And this is partially explained by the fact that in that same age group, there is a 12-point advantage for women over men with Warren and a 5-point gap with Klobuchar. Now I'm going to save this because I believe the evidence shows this to be the case for Iowa, and as I'm going to explain later, for New Hampshire when I get to those numbers in another video. That if people were absolutely honest in why they were voting for the candidate that they choose, and you listed at least 4 different criteria for choosing a presidential candidate, I would venture to guess that a plurality, more than the other 3 reasons, but not quite 50%, of women between 30 and 44 consider a candidate being a woman as being an overriding reason to support them. There's simply nowhere else that we see this big of a deviation between support among women and men than with Warren's support. The closest is with Biden among men aged 65 years or older, and I think it's fair to also attribute that to sexism. Now we're done with gender for now, and trust me, it's just for now. Let's move on to another prickly identity topic, and that is the topic of race. Now, the thing with Iowa is that like 90% of the population is white. 91% of the people voting in the Iowa caucuses were white. Sanders, however, does run away with non-white support, while holding even with Buttigieg with white support, meaning that it's pretty clear that the non-white vote won him the popular vote overall. This runs directly contrary to the whole white Bernie bro narrative that the dim, talentless hacks that dominate cable news and distinguished newspapers have propagandized and still propagandize to this day. Additionally interesting is that in Iowa, Sanders did much better among non-white women than with non-white men, further revealing that Bernie bro narrative as garbage, seeing as literally the opposite of the stereotypical race and gender of a Bernie supporter is in reality his strongest group. Biden is the only one with a significant showing with any subset of non-whites in Iowa, in this case that being non-white men, where he still loses to Sanders. Now, let's go down to a mixture of race and age. Sanders' strength among non-whites below 45 is obvious. However, he is beaten by Biden among non-whites above the age of 45. But it is notable how huge of a difference there is for Biden between those non-whites that are below 45 and those non-whites that are above 45. It is an extreme example of the general age trend that you see with Biden. Now, let's take a very short break from identity and look at educational level. Often education is used as a proxy for class. In Iowa, this is largely true, but it starts breaking down in bigger states. Sanders' support runs opposite to Buttigieg and Warren when you sort by education levels, with Sanders doing worse as you go higher up the levels of educational attainment. The only other candidate in which this is the case is with Biden, which feeds into both of their narratives as being the candidates of the blue-collar working class. Now, when you overlay it with gender, you come back to the picture that we saw before, but notably there is a 10-point gap between Buttigieg and Warren among women with some college. Now, we expect such a gap between Sanders and Warren, given that the some college group is likely to skew younger and Sanders just does better with younger people overall. But given what we've seen with Buttigieg, he doesn't really have any particular advantage among younger women over Warren. I suspect that this is probably connected to the unsaid reason that Buttigieg's 18 to 29 women's support is much higher than his 18 to 29 men's support. But as I say, you'll understand what I mean when I mention it, but I ain't gonna bother explaining it, because it's just tangential and, as I said, speculation. Now, we move directly on to education level and age. We get the same support by age story, but with a support by education level flavor, though it's clear that age is continuing to override all measures. The most interesting thing here is how Biden and Klobuchar's support among non-college and college-educated voters over 65 are nearly perfectly opposite to each other. Now race and education is missing some data due to insufficiently large sample sizes, but we can deduce with Sanders' 38% non-white support that we saw earlier that his support among college-educated non-whites is higher than among non-college-educated non-whites. This is a bit of a real-life Chekhov's gun, because based on what I've seen in polling, I suspect that moving on to Nevada and South Carolina, and the more non-white parts of the US in general, this is going to be an important thing to track. Now we get on to what some might consider the main event: class politics, class struggle, or more accurately, support by household income. Unsurprisingly, lower incomes equals Sanders doing well and Buttigieg doing worse, with the exact inverse for higher incomes. Additionally, the support of everyone else, particularly Warren, is pretty flat along income levels, with Klobuchar being a sort of exception. However, before anyone goes around yelling about class politics, I want to repeat something that I think is pretty important to remember. Despite already skewing older, 100K plus income voters support Sanders at a higher rate than 50-year-old voters. Income is, to an extent, a proxy for age. People with longer careers tend to make more, which is why Bernie being at 14% among 100K earners and 12% or less among voters over 50 is so important. Age is already dragging down that number. Yet, because that high income number hasn't compounded with doing worse with older people, we can tell that age is a stronger determinant of support for Sanders than income levels. I have yet to see a poll that shows this, but I can nearly guarantee you that a high-income millennial is more likely to support Sanders than a low-income boomer is. Not to bring in another country's politics into this, but I saw the same scenario in the UK's 2017 and 2019 elections, which I partly covered in my video How Labour Lost the 2019 UK general election. So yes, income levels appear to be a strong determinant of Sanders' support, but simply not as much as age is. And moving into larger states with more cities and people in piles of debt despite making six-figure incomes, you can bet that income won't be as clear-cut a determinant, especially if Warren's support really starts draining away into Sanders' support. Now let's move on to less interesting, but nonetheless important figures. Support by political orientation. This lines up pretty much exactly to how one would expect it to play out. More progressive people went to Sanders and Warren, less progressive went to more or less everyone else. And the most important thing to note here is that Sanders' lead with non-whites is so strong that he even wins non-white moderates/conservatives. This is important Because if these Iowa numbers are anything to go on, non-whites tend to self-identify as moderates or conservatives more frequently in the Democratic Party than whites do. Now going on to the party affiliation section, we come around to something that Sanders supporters must understand what their actual base is. Sanders did better than Buttigieg among committed Democrats than he did with independents, and vice versa. However, importantly, Warren's gap between Democrats and independents is huge, which makes the case that indeed Sanders is the more electable candidate. Biden also has a smaller than Warren, but still very significant gap between committed Democrats and independents. But the real interesting thing here is the question of who wins the urban, suburban, small towns, and rural areas. Literally for years, the mythos that I have never once bought, but many Sanders supporters have pushed, and keep on pushing, is that, oh, Sanders will be able to connect rural and small town America in a unique way, and it's the suburbs that we need to watch out for supporting centrists like Pete. Well, in Iowa, Sanders' victory can be attributed to crushing it with urban voters, tying or edging out Buttigieg in the suburb, despite potentially losing in the small towns and definitely losing in rural areas. Meanwhile, as appears to be consistently the case, Warren runs even everywhere. This is not about congratulating Warren over this, but dismissing the other fantasy of many Sanders supporters, the theory of rural voters, saving them from suburban and urban decadence, and the idea that Warren is simply too technocratic. She ran pretty even with Sanders among rural voters. Obviously, Sanders has a much stronger campaign than Warren, and is clearly the progressive standard bearer. Warren even appears to have abandoned challenging that claim for months now. It's just simply the truth. The so-called populist left does not outperform centrist neoliberalism by creating a magical new coalition. No, it builds on the coalition that centrist neoliberals have always wanted, and simply does it better than the neoliberals can. I don't want to get too philosophical here, but socialism often ends up acting as a fulfillment of values that liberalism is structurally incapable of living up to, and it appears that Sanders' coalition is shaping up to do just that. Also, support among LGBT is highest for Sanders. This isn't particularly surprising, but it's probably surprising to the media that Buttigieg sees literally no advantage here, except he might have had a boost that might be measurable in the fact that Biden and Klobuchar did terrible. So that's it for a look at the demographics of the Iowa caucuses. There's a whole lot more to look at regarding the views of people who support particular candidates, and I'm going to come back to that later, but I just wanted to get this video out in a timely fashion. I'm going to come back to the next half of this article after I do another video like this for the New Hampshire primaries, but it'll probably be in a different format, talking about coalition building for Sanders, and focusing on the ideas and perceptions that drive each candidate's voters. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, click the notification bell, and check out the other videos on this channel.